into positions of hopelessness and helplessness. The government gives them the drugs, builds bigger prisons, passes a 3-strike law, and then wants us to sing God Bless America. No, no, no. Not God Bless America. God Damn America. That's in the Bible for killing innocent people. God Damn America for treating us citizens as less than human. God Damn America as long as she tries to act like she is God and she is supreme.
All right, this is going to work this time. Greetings, the damned, and welcome to Pod Damn America, the goth socialist podcast for spooky Draculas that believe that there's power in a union. Nope, I fucked it up again, and we're just going to go. I don't know why I can't do this week, but it's fucking happening.
Yeah,
welcome to the podcast. I'm Jake Flores, host of Pod Damn America, and I've got with me Alex Ptak.
Hello.
He's sick and dying.
I'm doing fine.
He's not fine, folks. Not at all.
I'm at my best. I'm ready to go into history.
Pod Damn America's not sending their best.
Yeah. They come over here. All right. And with us this week is special guest and, depending on where you're listening to this, host of the podcast that you're listening to, Sean KB from the Antifada.
Welcome to Pod Damn America, where unrest is best. I am Sean KB, and happy to be here.
I liked that. That had a Vincent Price-esque twinge to it.
Bienvenidos a Pod Damn America.
In Univision.
That was very Sabado Gigante.
And Vivo.
It's a Gigante episode, Jake.
Yeah.
We are going to Mexico tomorrow, so.
Oh, I like it.
Well, speak for yourself.
Cool.
I'm not going anywhere.
Sorry, guys. As it's 30 degrees in the...
Oh, it is cold as fuck in here. Well, welcome to Pod Damn America this week, or the Antifada, as this is a cross pod. We'll be releasing this on both of our platforms as to share in the extremely niche market that we've both cornered, being, I feel comfortable saying, the top 2, at least, goth socialist podcasts on the internet.
Probably top 2.
As it happens.
I think that's totally fair to say. And, Antifada has already a series called History as a Weapon, which I have done and will continue to do. And I'm happy to have some of the damned join us in our mission of making history great again.
Oh, hell yeah.
It can be dangerous to share content, but that's what we're doing.
Content is a weapon. Noam Chomsky. That's a real quote.
Manufacturing content.
Yeah, definitely. If you are one of the damned and want to check out some great Antifada content, I would recommend listening to Sean's episode on historic materialism. Did I get that right?
Yeah, historical
materialism.
We're there.
Very illuminating stuff. I quite enjoyed it. So yeah, this will be a good sort of crossing of our various streams, given that we're going to talk a little history today, which is something
can be fun.
that if you've been listening to Pod Damn America, you might have caught on that our grift is that we do a smart one of these about once every 4 episodes, and then we kind of fuck off and talk about the news.
Damn, that's what we've been doing wrong. We try to be serious all the time. Fuck. Should be hanging out with more comedians, I
It's
tell
a
you.
mistake.
Yeah, we fucked up. We done goofed.
You could have more dog-themed episodes.
Well, we just had a 30-minute conversation about cat AIDS. So maybe you guys can come on as consultants or something.
It's not as bad as human AIDS. And I'll go on the record about that.
I mean, you're pretty sick right now. What have you been getting into, man?
Just,
Short hairs, long hairs, tabby cats, street cats. What's?
Yeah.
It was tabby cats. Let's move on.
Alex has been cruising for tabby cats. He's been hanging out in that neighborhood we talked about in the last episode, where those big dogs, anthropomorphic dogs, hang out. But it's just cruising out of the side of his car for like the cats from the Cats musical, just like hey, you like to party? Some tabby cat wanders up to him. Sorry, I've been watching The Deuce. Now all I can think about is...
Oh, great show.
Yeah.
Class struggle in that show, too.
I know.
Very topical.
And never talk to David Simon on Twitter because it's insane. He makes these great shows, and then he just gets on Twitter and yells at you for being in the DSA.
He's one of the classic waffle fuck guys. He takes two words and puts them together and gets you with them.
Yeah. That really lame type of old white guy cursing where
Yeah.
you're like, dick biscuit.
Yeah.
Like you were talking in your podcast, in your episode about your sister podcast, right?
Uh-huh.
I remember that.
Oh, yeah.
That was a real boost scare for me.
Hey, ass moron.
Hey, look at
The
that.
midterms are important.
Anyways, thank you for joining us this week. Without further ado, we should probably get into our topic for the week. We'll be doing a deep dive on the history of the IWW, the motherfucking Wobblies. You may be familiar with, being that they are the probably longest-standing labor organization in American history. Am I getting that right?
No.
Nope, not even close.
The AFL, but you're not that far off. It's only about 20 years difference. But
Hey, who's counting?
Not
This
me.
isn't a fact-based podcast.
leave the facts to us, Jake.
I will be doing exactly that, as this week's episode will be helmed by Alex Ptak, who will be
All
leading
right.
us through IWW history.
Well-
Take it away, Alex.
I think I'd like to approach the subject at first with a bit of conjecture and hearsay, you know? So what does everyone think of when you think of the IWW, the industrial workers of the world? You know that they're Wobblies. But what is a Wobbly? Jake, let's all say what we think a Wobbly is.
I think it's a hand job that you get on one of those public razor scooters that people keep getting into accidents on,
Sure.
and the whole time you're like, whoa.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're falling off, but you're also getting off. And in that way, it's the best way to travel. I think it could be a Jello that is also a boob. That could be one thing that it is. Sean, do you what does a Wobbly make you think?
Oh, I think from the history that I've gone through, that Wobbly is actually a type of music that comes out of New Orleans. I think Big Frida might be the most famous artist in the bounce genre.
Yes.
I'm thinking, wobbly, wobbly, wobble, 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 wobble. Excuse, I don't mean to be rude. My name is Joe Hill, and I'm a wobbly too. That whole
Yes,
thing, right?
yes. So in a way, it's all of these things because the Wobblies are all about solidarity. The industrial workers of the world are the one big union. That's what they were going for. You've heard of unions. Mm-hmm. When people in the workplace get together to share their common interest as workers and pit their power against that of the capitalist, of the boss, to team up. But the Wobblies take it a step further. Because being a Wobbly means that you're ready to be mean while wearing suspenders.
Hell yeah.
That's what it's all about. It takes the notion of a union, which is that you're getting together with your coworkers, but it takes it beyond just the people you work with in your company or in your trade or in your industry, and puts it all together into one big kind of Marxist class union. Workers together are workers, and so they belong together in one big union. And they take their fingers and they put them together, and it makes a fist. And then really, you don't even have to have like a sentence with that. You could just do that to people, and they're like, oh, I see, we're like a fist.
You got me with fisting. I'm in. Let's overthrow capitalism.
Right.
It also makes for a great meme when there's two fists, preferably two different colored arms attached to them, and they're going together like this, and you put something in the middle like SJW.
Right. Like, communists, Republicans having guns at the gun show or something.
Yes,
That's just
exactly.
off the top of my head.
Damn,
That
dude.
could be a
Honestly, a meme off the top of your dome, not bad.
I've been looking to get into making a meme sometime.
Mm-hmm.
One of the great things about the Wobblies is that the IWW made excellent propaganda. There was, of course, not digital, but they really did have the means of production, way back then. And we'll talk a little bit about why their propaganda was so great in a little bit.
We're gonna get into the thick and thin of it, but really, what you have to know, they're a union. They come out in around 1905.
Joe Hill was a shit poster.
He was.
Yeah, that makes sense. Sorry, go ahead.
That's why they strung him up. He wasn't just a keyboard warrior.
That was moderating back then. That was getting shadow banned.
Otherwise known as hung by a mob.
Shadow band used to be being hung by a mob. That's right. It was a different time.
It's literally the same thing.
But they're coming out in 1905. They're different than the other unions that are around, notably the AFL, American Federation of Labor, led by Sam Gompers,
Boo.
famous
Gompers.
shit lib of the past.
Gomper, I hardly know.
And you can tell kind of what they're about from their charter, which we have pulled up here, to some spooky music. So we thought we would just read to you from the charter just to kind of give you a bit about what they're about while playing a terrifying class anthem. So let's get started into that right now.
Would not be goth socialism without it.
So this is the preamble to the Wobbly Charter, which is essentially on our journey into IWW history, the Star Wars-esque crawl at the beginning of our film here.
All right, I'm hitting play on the music.
All right, let's get into this fucking intense crawl. The working class and the employing class have nothing in common. There can be no peace so long as hunger and want are found among the millions of the working people, and the few who make up the employing class have all the good things of life.
Between these two classes, a struggle must go on until the workers of the world organize as a class, take possession of the means of production, abolish the wage system, and live in harmony with Earth.
We find that the centering of the management of industries into fewer and fewer hands makes the trade unions unable to cope with the ever-growing power of the employing class. The trade union foster a state of affairs which allows one set of workers to be pitted against another set of workers in the same industry, thereby helping defeat one another in wage wars. Moreover, the trade unions aid the employing class to mislead the workers into the belief that the working class have interests in common with their employers.
These conditions can be changed in the interest of the working class, upheld only by an organization formed in such a way that all its members in any one industry, or in all industries if necessary, cease work whenever a strike or lockout is on any department thereof, thus making an injury to one an injury to all.
Instead of the conservative motto, a fair day's wage for a fair day's work, we must inscribe upon our banner not those cuck words, but the revolutionary watchword, abolition of the wage system.
It is the historic mission of the working class to do away with capitalism. The army of production must be organized not only for everyday struggle with capitalists, but also to carry on production when capitalism shall have been overthrown. By organizing industrially, we are forming the structure of the new society within the shell of the old.
Next time on Dragon Ball Z, Kakarot! Holy shit.
Yeah, dude, that's like
That was fucking intense.
Some revolutionary, scary ass shit. If you are a ruling class, that would scare the shit out of you. I tell you.
sometimes like at a Goldman Sachs retreats, they'll just like get around a campfire and just read this to each other.
What's that thing they have in Northern California that Alex Jones infiltrated?
Oh, Bohemian Grove.
Bohemian Grove, yeah.
Yeah.
They stand around the owl and they like burn that fucking preamble to the IWW Constitution like a hex.
Oh, get it out of here! Get rid of it.
No.
They're like, shut up, it's not real. It's not real. Stop trying to scare me.
Maybe Alex Jones is a wobbly.
He's wobbly.
Yeah, my man Wobbly.
Yo, he jiggles.
Now, since he took those new pills, I think he's pretty swole now. But, you know, he's a boss, not a worker, not part of the swoletariat. I'm sorry. That's how he fucking, divides society up.
He's
God
not
damn it.
swole, he's swollen, which is a completely different thing.
True. I did not mean to stand Alex Jones on the show. Yeah, that's later.
Oh, yeah.
He's definitely a boss.
It's phase 4 of the operation. That was pretty sick. I have to say, most pamphlets I get these days are just like, are you drinking too much? And This is way cooler.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, not to dwell on it, but yeah, I did get a pamphlet about cat AIDS and cat leukemia the other day from the vet. Not as inspiring, gotta say.
Mm-mm.
The last pamphlet I saw was about the problem with having your foreskin taken without your consent. And so that's how people see unions these days. They think it's taking your foreskin without your consent. It's totally different.
Love that segue.
So this is all just to say that the entire ideology, the entire concept behind the union is so different than whatever you're going to find showing up to the steel mill or wherever you work now, showing up to the Toys R Us cashiers union. I don't think they're going to have a pamphlet like this. So it's an entirely different background. Sean is a bit of an expert at this. So do you want to talk a little bit about the events leading up to the early 1900s?
Why, sure, Comrade Ptak. I can also mention, too, that I am in a trade union. I am in one of those Gompersite, corporatist, business, trade, craft unions that the IWW fought against. And I can tell you that nothing close to that preamble would get within 100 yards of my work site. That's for goddamn sure.
Well, you have to keep the racism in.
Well, of course, that was essential at the time and just as essential as it is today. In all seriousness, folks, I'm not racist.
Sean's not racist.
I swear. I just look racist. No white guy from Long Island has ever actually been racist.
Don't look into that.
Just believe us. Yeah, so something that folks need to understand about unions in America is that the U.S. was different from a lot of, from the European countries in that we're frontier. We're a settler colonial state. There was a bunch of free land. I don't know how we got it. I think there were some other people there, but they decided to go away. Things were kind of loosey-goosey over in the U.S. There wasn't a big, class system that was thousands of years old. So we developed in the U.S. quite differently from a lot of other countries. For that reason, our Constitution is in many ways a very, how shall we say, bourgeois constitution?
Mm-hmm.
That's how the French would say it.
They would, indeed, a bourgeois. The U.S. Constitution very much reflects what the United States was at its formation, which was largely a yeoman agricultural society with some very large, not-so-nice plantation owners in the South who did some mean things to a lot of people, and also a bunch of artisans who had these guilds that they'd work in where you'd go from apprentice to journeyman to master, but you had control over your trade and control over production. So the Constitution was written in this moment in time where the idea of class warfare didn't really seem to enter into it. So basically, what I'm trying to say is the U.S. Union movement had to create itself in very, very adverse legal and social conditions.
Right, because at the time, a lot of that sort of decentralized anarchist thinking was considered European and poofy and, not what we're doing over here in this. We're over here chopping down fucking trees and taking, land from these people that were like, it's finished. If you want to eat the rest of it, go ahead, and becoming journeymans. What's weird about this language? Journeyman, apprentice, master. Yeah. The only reason I know that shit is from playing World of Warcraft.
Oh, that sucks so bad. I went from an apprentice to a journeyman. There were no die involved. I didn't have to throw anything. I didn't get any constitution points when I became a journeyman.
Yeah.
America's formation was a bit different than that of many of the European nations because the orcs here had already been removed.
Yeah.
The only struggle was an internal one. So basically, just to kind of get past the beginning of this country and moving forward, really the big instrumental historical event, of course, of the 19th century was the Civil War, which was fought over states' rights. After that Just kidding. Slavery. See, I really got to watch my...
I'm sorry. You slipped that fucking line in so, slyly that I wasn't paying that much attention, and I was like, yeah, right, stage. Wait a minute, what the fuck did you just say?
I get myself in trouble.
Sean knows a lot.
So it really comes down to phrenology. No, I'm just kidding. No, so after this...
It's about fast twitch muscle fiber, okay? There's difference.
It was more of a war of northern aggression than anything else.
I've heard that before over the kitchen table last night. But anyways, the Civil War was fought, and the Civil War, because it was this industrial warfare, created a United States industry that was much larger. You also had, after the Civil War, the frontier, the West, being opened up with railroads, and the Mexican-American War having helped us have all this land from the Mexicans. So basically a real class system only starts to develop in the United States in the 1860s, 1870s. And so the United States is a bit behind other countries, but people try pretty, soon after the Civil War, and they fail a lot. That's one of the stories that of the U.S. labor movement, is that we have the most violent, bloody, brutal, and repressive labor history of pretty much anywhere in the entire world. So really, in the early United States, again, you had these old sort of traditional ways of producing things. But after the Civil War, those guilds start to break down as some masters.
Guilds also from World of Warcraft.
God damn it!
Just say.
I didn't realize that the history of radical unionism was so fucking nerdy.
I thought it was cool.
Well, that's just what separates you from us, okay? By that I mean the Antifada, where we take a strict no-gamer policy. FYI, if you'll ever come back. Jake, when he was on our show, as everyone should listen to, great episode, he did try to bring some whatchamacallit, the games that you put on top of a table. Tabletop games to the studio.
That's what those are called.
And, yeah, we turned him away, told him to come back later. But
You'll be crawling back.
Show up with the Monopoly box?
That's a board game. Tabletop games are more along the lines of like Warhammer, or my personal favorite, Betrayal at House on the Hill. But this is for another podcast.
Okay, all right.
So back to the class struggle. Bertel Ullman created a board game similar to Monopoly called Class Struggle in the 1960s. No, I'm just kidding. Going back, real talk. So basically, like, you started to have more and more of what we see now as a class system arise in the United States with industrialization, with the spread of U.S. Capital across the entire country. You started to see these guilds, which were a way for people to essentially go from the bottom as apprentices, work their way up to masters, and have some sense of independence. You also saw in the Northeast, places the original colonies, small farmers were unable to compete with the giant farms that were out in the Great Plains. So you started to see after the Civil War an uptick of class struggle. Now, this class struggle went on. There was small unionization drives, here and there. And the first attempt at a national union were the Knights of Motherfucking Labor. My God, that's another fucking game in
I was about to say that, so thanks for... I'm glad that I didn't even have to point it out.
So the paladins of labor were formed. Oh, man.
They mix high defense with faith.
Yeah.
What you saw was, because in the U.S. you could not legally block somebody from having a contract with somebody else, labor was considered a commodity like any other. So if I were to say go on strike and stop you from coming and taking my job, I'm stopping the flow of commerce. And this was true all the way up into the 1930s. So every time workers try to organize, they run into and they confront the power of not just capital to throw them out on their asses or replace them or kill them and hire private mercenaries, but also injunctions from the courts sending in National Guard troops to break their heads. In the Homestead strike, you had workers who were rolling giant barrels full of dynamite down at Pinkertons, who were shooting it up at them with cannons. That was the kind of class struggle we had at that point in time. There was no real legal outlet, let's say, right, within the Constitution, within the framework, for there to not be a bloody class struggle between this growing capitalist class and a much larger and much more, I don't know, how should we say, wild frontier, Wild West type working class at that time.
Interesting.
Not afraid to throw the fuck down.
It was like everyone who was working was like a Phillies fan at the time.
Pretty much, yeah. But yeah, you definitely have a, like I said, different situation from Europe and the U.S., as you pointed out. And, what starts to happen, because this is essential, right, folks? Like, understand that the guild system is a sort of self-contained industrial association of workers, who move through its ranks, and they have these skills, and they're able to hold on to those skills. And for that reason, if you're a cooper and you make a barrel, right, the three of us sitting around this table, we're the ones who know how to make a barrel from top to bottom.
Oh, we love making barrels.
Barrels, right? roll people down hills in them, fucking dynamite at Pinkertons, whatever you want to do with them.
Sometimes I put monkeys in the barrel.
Donkey Kong Country. It's a video game. Go ahead, move on.
Not tabletop. We'll accept it. But yeah, so with the increasing concentration and combination of capital, you start to see that guild system break down, and the traditional freedoms that the guild had, as oppressive as they could be, start to dissolve. People start to become, what's the word, proletarian. They start to have nothing to sell but their labor, and this whole entire work process, the industrial process, starts to become less and less skilled, right? As automation comes in, early steam and, factories, eventually assembly lines. So workers, even if they're skilled, are having less and less power over the actual shop floor itself. Not just what gets produced, but how it gets produced as well. This is an essential part for people to understand this distinction between what Alex called the craft unions and then industrial unions on the other hand. So the Knights of Labor arise as an attempt at a first industrial union, these paladins of work, and they fall apart after a great railroad strike in the 1880s, and then a new formation arises under Samuel Gompers called the American Federation of Labor, the AFL.
If you had it in a line, let's say just politically organized in terms of most left-wing kind of union, you would have the IWW. They're the most left-wing kind of union. They're essentially a Marxist union. All workers are in it together against capitalists and employers. Okay, so that's like a very specifically political, organized type of union. They don't come along till later. Next up on the scale, if you're moving rightward, you have industrial unions. That means if you work... the three of us make barrels, and we work at the barrel company.
Mad barrels.
The Cracker Barrel.
The Cracker Barrel.
They need a fucking union, but anyway. Well,
Actually, our company's called the Barrel Crackers.
we're strike breakers.
Yeah. We're part of the AFL, and that we're racist.
It's the only part.
That's our preamble.
So
It's just one word that starts with an N.
And you gotta jump in here if I'm wrong. But so we're making barrels.
Doing good so far.
We're the Barrel Crackers. Yeah. If we were in an industrial
The
union,
Dixie Chicks opening band. The Barrel Crackers.
God damn it.
He's too sick for this kind of shit, Jake.
Get like every third word out.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
If the Barrel Crackers are in a industrial union, we would be unionized not only with the people who put the barrels together, but with the people who bring the wood in, with the people who put the monkeys in the barrel. All of us together are in the barrel-making industry, and so we are organized together, and we meet up and go on strike when the barrel police are sticking it to us, and we can't eat no more.
So that's industrial or craft?
That's industrial. Craft would be
if it was just
if the barrel crackers, just the people who put the barrels together are together in a union.
Or even worse, as was the case in the period that we're talking about, the late 19th century. Jake, takes the wood for the barrel and sets it up. I'm the one that puts that ring around it,
right?
And then Alex is the one that cuts the top and the bottom off, puts the suspenders on it, and then wears it as he walks around.
Yeah, right. The final form of production.
Yes, that's right. So we would each be represented separately within that.
Also known as being nude in the past. Everyone was just in a barrel. And then jumping down a waterfall for some reason.
Anyway, this
Simple
is how
pleasures of the 19th century.
This fits into the diagram because as you're moving farther along to the right of your labor organization, you're getting more and more alienated from your other workers around you on the left. So if just the barrel putting together team is in a union together, they're kind of pitted against the people who bring the wood in.
Interesting.
But you're at a more specific point for labor to fight for specific trades and labor. So the AFL is a notoriously corrupt organization for a lot of reasons. Again, they're racist.
And the AFL, that's
political.
That's the football league that Donald Trump started in the 90s.
You're thinking of the XFL.
Oh, never mind. Throw out all of the research I've done for this podcast.
AFL is America's funniest.
But was also racist. The XFL it was Donald Trump's football team.
Yeah, the one unifying factor here.
The sport that racism built.
Anyway, the more you break these things up, the easier it is to actually argue for specific gains for that one thing. So if, just the barrel team wants a raise and we can leave the wood people out to dry, you can actually get that raise, but at what cost?
Okay, so I think that what I'm understanding about this spectrum of various forms of unionization at the time is that we're going from right to left, as you said, right being the more specific craft unions of the I put the fucking spigot on the barrel, I do the one specific part of production, to where there's a burgeoning idea of, wait a minute, if we include more people and make this an entire industrial union, then we have more solidarity and we're less divided and we're less able to be manipulated by the bosses until we get to this ultimate fucking light bulb idea, which is the IWW being one big fucking union. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, that's pretty spot on. And so folks know what Alex was saying is not just an abstraction. When you look at these labor struggles that are happening, around the time that the AFL is being formed, what the bosses would do is they would literally, there'd be maybe 500 workers who would be doing very skilled tasks. They would be under an AFL union. They'd be taken care of very, very well. They were often native born or, assimilated. And then you'd have maybe 5,000 unskilled, workers within that same factory who would be paid barely enough to live off of. And the bosses were really, really great at pitting those groups against each other. Now, I want to make one small defense of the AFL. It's not around its racism. It's about its sexism. No, I'm just kidding. So the AFL, the reason why it's been around for so long is because it was militant. When you think of left and right, you think, like conservative in terms of like tactics and shit like that. But when the AFL wanted to throw the fuck down, they threw the fuck down. It's still the case in the building trades in New York City. Like, I've been on several wildcat strikes before. Like, that sounds crazy. Oh my God, a wildcat! But it's just something that people do it, and that's considered a very left-wing, militant.
Yo, you trying to party?
You trying to get cat aid? So the other thing to mention too on this left-right political spectrum is that it's very controversial, but in a sense, the American Federation of Labor and the IWW have a similar sort of connection to the state. Or conception of the state, because the AFL under Gompers, there were socialists in it as well. McGuinn was another founder of it. They purposefully developed this, through the course of their struggle, decided to stay out of politics. Right? They would not hew to one political program. They wouldn't support one political party because they saw politics as not just corrupting in a sense, right, but also as something that they couldn't rely on. They had to rely on themselves, their ability as skilled workers to strike, to have a jurisdiction, and to force the bosses to sit down with them at a table, and operate. The IWW, as we'll see, momentarily, also is anti-politics in a sense, right? But they just come at it from a different perspective in that, like, the state that we live in is a capitalist state and must be destroyed and replaced by, a cooperative commonwealth of the workers. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. And one of the reasons I had in the intro here that people don't even associate a union with a worker solidarity and kind of just think of it as corruption and like kind of like a Democrat thing is because around the time of the New Deal, labor gets behind the Democrats for all these labor reforms pitted specifically against the Republicans, and then that's used against them later to pass all these new labor relations board amendments that end up actually kind of breaking down legally what you can even do in a union. So staying out of politics was kind of a good idea in terms of party politics.
Would you, am I getting this right if I'm to understand that the IWW in that specific way that they're anti-political is a little bit akin to they're like anarchistic in some way?
That's very fair to say. I've read a couple books. Again, I went back and studied the IWW. And Dubofsky's his name. He wrote kind of like the book on the IWW, and he describes them as having four currents. So when they arise in 1905, right, when they come out of the Western Federation of Miners, who had learned in the Colorado labor wars, what was necessary for their struggle, and it was not just industrial unionism, but for many of them revolutionary unionism, right? they basically discovered that they had this strange mixture of Marxism, right? Because you see the class analysis right in the preamble, right? It's about, the proletariat and the capitalist.
Right.
But also, as you said, anarchism, and a specific type of anarchism, which still exists to this day, called syndicalism, which is this conception that the creation of unions today will literally be that which runs society in the future. So in the Spanish Civil War, in the 1930s, the Antifada was an anarcho-syndicalist union that literally had a socialist revolution, and communized production within Spain under the auspices of a union. Right, this is very radical to think about, but they were creating the new world in the shell of the old in a real sense as they organized themselves, producing things. And then the last two are kind of weird. He says that they have a Darwinian sort of sense. The Wobblies do, which they flip social Darwinism on its head, and it's the capitalists who are like these weak, cucky, like waspy guys in the Northeast, and they're all like brute hobos with like one eye and fucking hunched over with a pickaxe ready to fucking destroy them, which I kind of like as imagery. And then the last strain is like Christian millennialism, because like they saw this miraculous they saw this like miraculous general strike coming down in like the imminent future that would just like completely wash away like every semblance of like class society and hierarchy and the division between black and white and men and women and all that good, happy horse shit. So it was a very complicated organization. But their ideas, it's fair to say, are Marxist, anarchist, syndicalist, whatever.
I'm just imagining, like, winning over people in a farm somewhere, just being like, in a way, Jesus was a union rep.
Christian millennialism, that's when the Tide Pod is Jesus' body and you eat it. And then you boof the cracker. Yeah. You put it up your ass to get more high on his love or whatever.
Jesus dabbed for your sins.
If he had dabbed, he would have been not on a cross at all. On a much different,
I've said this before. If dabbing changed anything, they make it illegal.
If any of you millennials out here who are thinking about starting a union after this episode, I don't know. I'm really scared. I don't want to put Tide Pods in my butthole. I don't
you have to for solidarity.
Yeah.
Fine. I'll go from a skilled craft worker into a butt tide.
Take notes. Unionist. This is how you scare your boss.
The butt tide.
You come at him with millennial shit, eating cleaning products and putting things in your own asshole.
La lucha continua.
It's how you fight the fight. Okay.
Yeah.
No, IWW, they fought the fought.
Fucking Joe Hill just starts singing a song about his own asshole.
He's got the tattoos on his face like that white kid who does that dumb shit.
Joe Hill was the SoundCloud rapper of the IWW. He was Tekashi.
I feel like you're talking about Post Malone, though, right? The white guy who does the dumb shit?
Yeah.
I think so, yeah.
Post Malone is the white guy who does
He's
the
white guy who
shit,
does the dumb
sure.
shit.
Yeah.
Without even asking.
I thought, every Halloween I think of the Halloween costume I should have been like, I think of the day after Halloween. I should have been Post Malone and then just written a bunch of tweets on my face.
Yeah,
just,
yeah.
Facebook Post Malone.
Could have been Toast Malone.
Also good.
Showed up all burnt.
Yeah.
Crispy fried.
A bit more about the IWW.
Yeah, let's start the goddamn thing.
Let's do it.
It's 1905, right?
Heck, let's get into it.
Tell us, Alex.
So you see them starting at 1905, with their peak at around 1923. It's estimated they had anywhere from 58,000 to 150,000 members at the same time. But also that they could have had 800,000 to 1 million members passing through the IWW altogether, which is crazy when you match those two numbers back to back, because that means people are essentially dropping in and dropping out in the span of like a couple months whenever they need it. It's just like a fire department that shows up at your town.
Yeah, hard to keep track of because much like Communist Party later on, DSA now, there's like fucking people that just join in for one action or something, people that drop out, people that don't show up to your fucking open mic, but they're still in the Facebook group for some reason, and
it's a random example,
just filling in space. And what are you doing? people that, I mean, they say they're committed to the guild, but they don't show up for raids on Thursday nights when so all the good loot's going to drop and you need healers.
It's like your fucking Patreon patrons who don't update their credit card information at the end of the month.
Right, that's so disrespectful. And
Yeah.
that's the kind of issues you would run into organizing a big union like this. No one's updating their Patreon information.
Yeah.
So the reason why those two numbers, the difference between what'd you say, 100,000 and
150,000 is estimated to be the most they had at once.
in 1917 was it?
with
I think?
800,000 to 1 million
Right.
in total.
Well, this is, I think, again, I always like to ground this shit in political economy and motherfucking historical materialism because there's a real reason why, this is the case. The fact that we live in houses and are relatively stable, this is going away, but at this moment in U.S. history, like we have this sense that we should have a career and not just be itinerant workers going from a mine to a fucking lumber mill to fucking go pick vegetables in the fucking summertime to go travel down and do other weird hobo shit. That's actually what the union movement kind of created in the United States. In the period that leads up to and, of course, is part of the IWW history, guys, people would literally, just be traveling around the country trying to find work in all these different areas seasonally, and work wasn't stable like it was today. And the people that the IWW looked to organize, or were very successful at organizing, were immigrants and migrants. And I say immigrants in two senses. They were either immigrants in the fact that they came from another country to the United States, or they were immigrants in the sense that they had small farms, whether in the U.S. or in Europe or elsewhere, but they were migrants to the proletariat, to the working class. They'd been kicked off their farms. They now, for the first time in their lives, had to rely on a wage, and they're traveling around this frontier, this Wild West, trying to figure out, how to make a living here and there. And those were the people that the Wobbly idea and the Wobbly form of organization really was able to tap into, because you could take that Wobbly card, right, the IWW card, if you had the red card, and you could use that at a lumber mill. You could use that in as a migrant farmer, in California. You could use that as a railroad worker. It was really designed for like the lowest of the low. They call them the bum brigade, right? They're like literal hobos, guys with fucking, those weird hats and bindles and shit. That was largely what the IWW consisted of. Those people would come in for a big strike to the IWW. They'd win some wages. Sometimes they wouldn't. But then when the struggle was over, they'd, I guess, still be members, but they'd just kind of fade away, into the sunset. So it was a very, very itinerant sort of workforce.
Sometimes they just leave town and your pie would be gone.
Well,
They'd have a knife for stabbing and also peeling apples.
The Whittlers, their first local, the Whittlers, Local 1, they made some very nice
They made a lot of gains for whittlers.
Yeah.
If it had been,
They probably focused way too much on that, thinking it was going to span out a lot wider than it did.
That's the tragedy, is they really fall apart when they put half of their resources into the Great Whittling Strike of 1923.
They really focused too much on selling pots and pans as head accoutrements. But, hey, man.
Who are we to judge?
The future's a mystery.
Yeah, exactly.
So a bit more stats here, and I spread this out a bit in the outline, so I lost it earlier. But just in the first few decades that the IWW is active, again, going town to town, getting bums to show up and organize your workplace, they created over 900 unions in 38 states and were involved in 150-plus strikes. And keep in mind, this is not that many people involved for not that long of an amount of time. So that's pretty dynamic workmanship right there. You see them showing up in places like Goldfield, Nevada in 1906. They have their first ever sit-down strike in Schenectady in 1907.
It's not just there only. It's actually the first sit-down strike in the United States. And for
People didn't know you could sit down.
Certainly not at work. 16 hours a day on your feet.
It was a leaning and cleaning situation.
Well, they sure leaned into it. And, the first sit-down strike, which would become a huge tactic, which is not to leave the factory, but to occupy the factory, which the CIO would do a great job of in the 1930s. But go
that
on.
was pretty cool. The one I really want to talk about, so I have a few other examples here. McKees Rocks, Pennsylvania. In Spokane, Washington.
Hell yeah.
there is an issue where the workers are essentially not allowed to speak about their labor problems around town anymore, I guess. This was a time period where you could just create a town law that talking with a frown on is illegal. And so that's the law. And then the IWW shows up to town. They send in their representative who's like they have a fiery Irish lass by the name of Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. And she would show up and just get everyone all amped up. She'd have them all talking about like hours and wages and stuff. And they'd be like, oh, yeah, that's right. Your hair's so red. They'd say stuff like that.
Yeah, that was mind-blowing at the time.
But anyway, so they set this town-wide
Just walking
quorum.
around showing her ankles and shit. Getting everyone all fucking horned up.
There were times when they kept her out of prison. Deadass, I'm not even lying.
That's badass.
Yeah. She was 19, by the way, when this happened.
She's 19.
19 years old.
This is one of those paid protesters you hear about now, but like
Bust her in from out of town.
traveling around the country. So the IWW shows up and essentially makes it a free speech campaign. They just send in waves and waves of people to go and rile up the workforce and go and bother the sheriff until the police show up and just start carting them off to jail. So their plan was to just fill up the jails with as many people as they could until the town can't afford to pay to keep them in jail anymore and just gives up and abides by the labor's demands.
That's such a good bit. Like, my understanding of the past is extremely fragmented and tainted by my main source of education being television. So I'm just like picturing some Don Knotts ass sheriff just like, golly, there's too many hobos coming in. We filled up the goddamn room already.
The whole town's out of pies.
Stop all boxcars immediately.
That fucking rules. Just the concept of like, there's just too many of us for you to fit in your fucking
It's
dumb
just
room.
inconvenient for you. 500 of them went to jail and 4 died. So that's what's going on here. And the fact that would happen and then everyone else would be like, this is an effective tactic.
Well, they did it in several states. I mean, it was really impressive because people are familiar with this from, current events. And what the IWW would do is they go, there are all these kind of, wishy-washy, snowflakey type politicians in Spokane and elsewhere, who got their feelings hurt when people talked about the class struggle. So an IWW guy would show up to town. They'd build a crib. He'd put a diaper on, and he'd sit in the crib and with a bottle and go, we want the revolution.
And we all learned a lot about free speech that day. Yeah.
Well, the great Wobbly Charlie Kirk once said, the Spokane shit was fascinating. They also did it in San Diego and elsewhere. But this idea is that they would soapbox, right? So the workers would often get engaged in a struggle. And the Wobblies, they didn't have a lot of money, the key organizers, and we're talking people like Big Bill Haywood. We're talking about guys like Joe Hill, John St. Vincent, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, Mother Jones, yada, yada, yada. They were dedicated as fuck. So of this core group of WOBs, when they called people to Spokane, they would show up to Spokane. You had soapboxing, literally, like they would put a fucking soapbox down.
You'd stand on a box.
You'd stand on the box, and you'd yell at people about the revolution. And that was a time when, like, a lot of people were pretty fucking hyped on the revolution. They're like, cool. So as you said, they'd pass an ordinance that said that was illegal, and then they could not stop the IWW volunteers and organizers from coming into town, standing up on that soapbox, and getting thrown into jail. And the shit that they would do to them in jail, you said the 4 people died. 4 people died, and many more were essentially tortured. But the authorities were shocked and ultimately appalled and, put in their place. I almost said cucked, but I've used that word twice already, by the fact that they could not stop them from coming. So these free speech battles were really a way to spread this idea of revolutionary industrial organizing throughout the working class, but usually tied to a specific struggle, like in Spokane, which is about the lumberjacks and how shitty it was to live in a fucking tent in the middle of the woods with only homeboys,
So to the point about Joe Hill and this concept of soapboxing, something that's interesting about this, when I try to relate this to propaganda, it's interesting to me because there is a concept on the left today that I think is I've taken it upon myself to make it a little bit of like an issue. I think that there's maybe a contingency of leftists that overcorrect when it comes to culture, because currently culture, because we have like an absence of any real power on the left in America, you know, people tend to put their stock too much in culture, and we have this really obnoxious idea that, you know, comedians are philosophers and truth tellers,
Right.
and fucking Beyonce is going to change society, and that artists are the architects of society, right? I got
The
into
revolution is gritty.
yeah. I would argue that Gritty's not an artist. He's just a
He's a
regular
worker.
He's a
Yeah.
pro. He's a pro. Yeah, we know.
Yeah.
It's still a preconceived notion, though. You know.
And it's a little bit more complex than that, in my opinion. I got into a kind of a back and forth on Facebook with Amber Ali Frost from Chapo about this yesterday, about whether or not Joe Rogan is necessarily dangerous, which I kind of...
Well, he's very strong.
I'm a little worried that a lot of people maybe listen to that podcast while sleeping and then just wake up and they're like, classical liberalism. I don't know. It just makes sense to me.
Subliminal.
But you know, but you think about at least propaganda, and I guess I really like Joe Hill, and I feel a little bit of a kinship with him because, you know, with this soapbox stuff, us being stand-up comedians, we are really 3 degrees removed from shit like this. We come from a tradition of, like, you know, vaudevillians. We're essentially carnies. We're like neo fucking in the future cyberpunk extension versions of fucking carnies. And I mean, it's really obvious if you read about like the way that they would actually get like the word out about this anti-capitalist shit they were talking about. Joe Hill would do stuff like fake like being robbed.
Right.
He would have a guy run around and go, "Oh my God, this guy's been robbed. This guy's been robbed." And then everyone would gather around and go, "Oh my God, are you okay?" And he goes, "I've been robbed. I've been robbed. I've been robbed by capitalism."
Yeah.
And then everyone,
Yeah.
you know, if it happened today, everyone would groan and go, "God damn it, it's another fucking, you know, leftist podcaster or whatever." But, you know, it's,
I quit the Spartacus League over that tactic. Couldn't do it anymore.
It's a real life podcast.
People hated
Get
it more.
outta here.
People hated it more than Showtime. Believe it or not.
right. This is the fucking original Showtime, though. You know, it's a pretty good bit, especially, you know, given the limited amount of materials you're working with back in the day. But also, something that's really interesting historically, if you look at like what he was doing with songwriting, was, you know, he had this thing called the Little Red Songbook, and in it were a collection of folk songs, and folk songs function in a really specific way, especially these ones where he would take music that, you know, he would take the tune of something that people already knew and rewrite a song with a message in it, prepackaged into a tune that people already know. It's just so it would get in people's heads, because that's a more effective way of getting your word out than, say, you know, some dense piece of literature or something. And that's why I think there's a parallel between that and, like, why does a fucking podcast about leftist politics in 2018 need to be funny? You know, why does it need to be fucking interesting? It's a really clever method, and it's, you know, it's if you've ever like had that moment where you're like, wait a minute, Twinkle Twinkle Little Star and the Alphabet Song are the same song. That's what he's doing with songwriting back then, and it's
Trying
really
to teach you the alphabet.
Of class struggle.
but it's
Help! This man's being taught the alphabet of class struggle.
A is for abolition. B is for the bourgeoisie. C.
C's for
Let's
class
hear him
struggle.
out.
But it's really the last vestige of like sort of a verbal tradition. I mean, if you look at the history of like where even you know, fucking poetry and shit like that comes from, and like the you know, the old timey fucking the reason all the old Greek odysseys and shit rhyme is because, like, you couldn't write that shit down. You would memorize it and make it metered out or whatever. Right. And so, like, this is a really interesting last vestige of that being a way to get information out and sort of you know, use the cry of revolution to appeal to people's emotions and get it to stick to them. You know.
No, that's actually a really interesting point. I mean, you have to see at this moment there is radio, right? In the early, barely.
I think it's like just
it's just starting. There's certainly no TV. You know, there's a couple of really interesting things attached to this. The first is, as you said, this oral tradition thing. Joe Hill and the others who wrote those songs, were kind of hearkening back to social unionism, which I mentioned briefly, the Knights of Labor, right? What the Knights of Labor, the first kind of industrial national union, what they tried to do through social unionism was to have the union be everything essentially for people, to be a community of labor. So it was a secret society that had its own internal courts, court system, but they also had their own choral groups. They also had their own they would have picnics and sports games and things like this. So the idea of the union kind of encompassing the entire community, having a whole songbook, right, that people can recognize these songs and repeat them. It was also very practical at the same time, because did you guys know that the greatest enemy of the IWW was not the ruling class, the capitalist class? It was the Salvation Army.
I did not know that.
Oh, wow. In all your research, you
wasn't
never got it? Well, because, when the Wobblies form and, they make themselves known, obviously to be a secular, Marxist, syndicalist, revolutionary union group, right, you had to be anti-Christian. So oftentimes the mayors and the local capitalists, when they'd be, trying to organize in a community and they'd be on their soapboxes, they would bring out the troops, which was the Salvation Army, who had their own, means of making really loud sounds and songs and shit like that. And you'd have
the thrift store?
Yes, literally, the Salvation Army. It was a Christian group.
They would come out and throw old books that smell really uncomfortably like an old car at you.
This is why most Wobblies who are left over now are hipsters, because they took all those clothes and
because they were attacked literally with old blazers and shit with patches on the elbows.
They're like, finally, we'll just put them on. Just leave us alone.
If you throw a cheap candle at someone, it hurts.
Yeah.
But so
a pair of underwear. Why would anyone try to resell this?
Hobos would. Under IWW hobo communism, nobody will own their own underwear.
The underwear is your toothbrush.
Oh man, put some motors in it and make it a Quip. This show is sponsored by Quip. I was watching the Majority Report earlier, and they were advertising, and there's a stupid toothbrush that's apparently better than every other toothbrush.
You think you're better than me?
The Wobblies did not live in an era of lots of different toothbrushes. That's, I think, you get on another good point too, is how primitive this form of capitalism was at this time. We can recognize the kind of class distinctions that existed, but all of the accoutrements with branding and shit like that didn't, and a comedian having to go out and go on this circuit and create a kind of persona for themselves, or a building trades guy like myself having to settle down. It's a lot of this shit was very much not of that time period. It was this kind of Wild West sort of situation. And what better way to unify people than songs, songs that people could sing to each other around the campfire, but songs that could also drown out those Christian Salvation Army fucking shock corps that would come out in order to stop the godless communists whenever you came to town. Another real quick, interesting historical materialist fact about it, if you guys don't mind.
Go right ahead.
The Wobblies, when they formed in 1905, had no fucking money. They had no money at all. And people were, the main organizers were super hyped about doing it, but they're yeah, we can't pay you shit. So imagine a union official without any money. He's traveling around the country in a boxcar and shit like that. The only way they could make money, and they were encouraged to do this, was by selling pins and pamphlets and eventually the Little Red Songbook. So basically they said, you go out and proselytize the IWW, start all these strikes and shit. We can't pay you, but you can make a little commission off of that songbook over there.
A merch table.
That was exactly what I was going to say. They were in
union merch table.
They were in the fucking Bouncing Souls, essentially. They give a big speech. Listen, everyone, thank you for coming out tonight. We're all brothers and sisters. I can't pay you, but I can give you... This is it's called a baby doll size T-shirt. It's for women. None of them are at this show.
Buy a poster for our partner touring union.
That is really interesting, though. That thing about like pins and stuff like that, sort of going back to that point in history, because I don't know. I was just reading about that today, and I was thinking about how when you think about how that stuff edged its way into punk culture that is bleeding into the times that we live in. There's maybe possibly a historical original reason for how that got into DIY culture that is still relevant on some level today.
I have read a lot about the Wobbs in the last week, and I've never seen anybody have that take. but I think it's actually there's something convincing about it, because remember too that the hobo, because we keep going back to these references of stealing the pies and and the soapbox and all this shit, like that still exists as like a historical memory in this country, and the IWW was a real part of that, and they were in a sense a subcultural thing. And I'm not saying there is a direct correlation between like me going and buying an Aus Rotten fucking ass flap when I was like in 1996 when I was a young punk rock kid and like Joe Hill or whatever, but I think there is something about that aesthetic and that sense of like DIY that maybe still kind of lives in the United States, and the IWW can't be separated from that, I don't think.
Yeah, I don't know. Could be not. Could be coincidence.
It's your thesis. This is your thesis now. You're in the master's program of communism. This will be your thesis.
Right.
We expect it by next year.
I'll defend it or die. Pins are because of fucking turn of the century socialism. Suck my dick.
I'll buy that for $1. Not your dick, the pin. Your dick's worth way much more.
Buy one, you get the other. Buy the ticket, take the ride.
So you got this great group. They're making all these great strides. 1905 to 1917, knocking it out of the park.
Making
Everybody
money
loves
moves.
these guys.
Making money moves.
And then something very important happens, which is that America goes to war. And if there's one lesson you can take away as just a big, broad strokes trend in history, is that whenever the country goes to war, labor gets fucked every time, because everyone gets the imperialism bug and wants blood in their mouth. And when that happens, and you're in charge of making bayonets or the barrels for the barrel crackers have to load up the barrels with ammunition, and all of a sudden they want to go on strike, you look like an asshole because everybody else is on a murder boner.
I love how we keep falling back on the Coopers. The Coopers unions. Those barrel-making motherfuckers. Any Coopers out there making barrels?
It was all about barrels. And so there is a strong turbulation in the IWW in 1917. All of the leaders are arrested. This is also, other big event that happens in 1917, the beginning of the Soviet Union.
Ah, yes.
It's the time when people are coming out and being anti-war, because the big war everyone's fighting is fucking stupid.
Fucking stupid.
It doesn't make any sense.
God,
even less than most of the wars.
We just passed the 100th anniversary of it ending like last week.
Yeah, Trump said some weird ass shit on Twitter about it. And it was just like, it was pretty fucking cool. And then
Folks,
we were all reminded.
why don't we have trenches?
Yeah.
Why does Trump make me feel solidarity towards people like Macron? That's the worst thing about him.
Yeah.
He's canceled.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I'd like to maybe correct you a little bit about all these advances that they made up and leading to their ultimate near destruction in the First World War. One issue that the Wobblies had, and this was a structural issue, is that they could go into a place and they could convince the fuck out of a bunch of Hungarians, Italians, Asian child workers,
even
black,
Hungarians.
even believe it or not, fucking Hungarians. They could put out newspapers in all their languages. They could get up on their soapbox. They could organize them for a strike to win wages, but they weren't really good at forming long-lasting unions, locals, organizations that could be organized for the future, because bless their hearts, I think that their propaganda is beautiful, and I think that the vision they had of class struggle is really inspiring to us today. But they weren't the best at like putting down roots, let's say.
Sure.
So even by 1917, and then certainly after that, but by 1917, you start to see already that like they're good at some things, but like they're not the best organized in the world. They could have gone to Crate and Barrel, figured out some sort of like storage system. I don't fucking.
Something that I think is maybe relevant to us as people that are involved in organizing today and facing the struggles that we face today, and even being in like fucking DSA or something like that, is when you look at the history of IWW, there is this big hanging question over the entire organization, which is that is this about long-term shit, this big ass revolution that we're all working towards, or short term. Your little individual reason that you're in this organization, and trying to overcome some very specific obstacle that's in your time and place. And it seems like, because that's such an existential question for an organization with with as ambitious of a goal as the IWW, that it inevitably created disagreements and schisms and stuff within the organization that led it to maybe not just pan out in any way.
So many schisms.
Let's not forget too the context that this is a time when the Socialist Party under Debs could get 10% of the vote of the working people in the United States, which is incredible. You had, before that even, tons of different political socialist organizations. You had socialist mayors in Bridgeport, Connecticut, Butte, Montana, Schenectady, all over the country. This is happening in a real moment when more and more Americans, as they see this class system arise, are starting to think of political questions, right? Like, who do we vote into office? What's going to be our program once those people get into office, right? And then you've got these people who say, fuck all that voting shit. We need to be organized on the shop floor, before we can even start to tackle the bigger sort of political electoral issues. And you see that, I think, mirrored a lot today in the DSA. This huge split between, are we going to confront the electoral sphere? Are we going to put up politicians? Or are we going to organize tenants? Are we going to endorse Cynthia Nixon, or are we going to, start to salt unions all over the country, right? And the IWW is caught in this big ferment where they take the strong economistic side, where they say, we are going to focus on the shop floor. That's, I think, one of the huge lessons today. That, and also that DSA, if there's a war, don't vote for the war.
Don't vote for the war.
Don't vote for the war.
It's never good for you.
Not good.
Not
people.
one time.
Not good.
It's interesting you say that, though, because they have all these schisms, like the 1908 schism. They essentially kick out the electoralists in the union, and they go off and form their own group. And that way they have this solidified purpose for what they're doing, and they know exactly what they're doing. They're creating the revolution on the shop floor. But when the primetime IWW does collapse, it is mostly due to internal schisms.
Yes, that's right.
So it's good to clean house and get your motivations clear, but also don't destroy your entire organization doing it.
Yeah, maybe a lesson for you DSA people out there. Don't do what the IWW and the SDS did before you, and every other left group ever.
Yeah, it seems to just be the eternal fucking
The
disease
left is all
of the
about
left.
fake friends when you get down to it.
Yeah.
We also skipped, by accident, my favorite story out of the entire IWW strike lexicon. Paterson, New Jersey, 1913. During a town-wide strike, the IWW tries to raise money to support the workers over the year by putting together a dramatic reenactment in New York City, and so they get very focused on essentially creating this parade in the middle of town, and they spend months on it, and they spend all this money on it, and they invite the entire town to go watch a dramatic reenactment of their strike.
Just to another point about propaganda and culture and comedians talking about stuff, your band having a point, you need... nerds do not know what other people are gonna like. No, you can picture these people going "This is gonna be great. Everyone's gonna love our historical reenactment." And look at that, and then look at fucking something else from the past, like Frank Sinatra or something. Which of these things actually stuck to culture? You can't put the nerds in charge of making art. It's not by them.
Not only is the art kind of stupid or whatever, because it's a dramatic reenactment of a strike, but they fill out a stadium with workers, and they decide that because they're a union, they're only going to charge workers 10 cents of the dollar ticket. So they don't raise any money. They raise no money. It's like a 3-month-long project, and then they have to cancel the strike because they went bankrupt making the parade.
DSA, that plan you have to rent out Yankee Stadium for the Ariana Grande show and charge $2 at the door, maybe
the Return of Grimes concert.
We've taken her back from Elon Musk. She's proletarian again. But no, that's interesting that you mentioned that, because the Patterson strike was actually kind of like a reenactment almost of the Lawrence strike, which was much more of a success, where they did an incredibly great, not just direct action, but also piece of propaganda when the bosses were attacking them. And I don't mean that just figuratively, like literally people were getting their shit kicked out of them.
Oh, yeah, this rules,
in
yeah.
Lawrence. The people on the ground, the organizers, and also the central IWW headquarters decided that they would take a cue from what European workers had done. Again, people have to understand, too, that not only are the people within the IWW and the working class at this time in America international, they're also internationalist. So they're talking with people in Belgium, in France, and in Italy. And one of the tactics they had in those countries, the syndicates, the syndicalists, and the trade unionists over there, was when the bosses started the violence, and when the bosses started to kick people out of the company housing, when the bosses started to beat people with axe handles, is they would send their children elsewhere. And they end up doing this in this great textile strike in 1912, 1913, where all of the workers' children, not all of them, but many of them, were sent down to sympathetic families, often in the Socialist Party and other, unions down in New York City. And it was an amazing propaganda feat because, what is more compelling than saying, like, look at these greedy textile capitalists who are forcing these workers to train their kids, send them by train. It looked real bad.
So bad.
Like when they showed up at Grand Central, all like, hungry and poor, and
I have a train full of kids here. And then the best part is the Lawrence PD catches on to what they're doing and tries to stop the trainloads of
God,
kids.
this is horrible.
And so they're like intercepting them at the train station and sending them back.
They were beating people up, and like the kids were getting trampled, and the whole news media of the United States was there. This is a great idea. Let's just beat up all the children, and we can win this fucking thing.
And that's how the Lion Witch in the Wardrobe happens.
Yeah, it was like that. And so Patterson even was like, they lost that one, but like not just because of that stupid nerd thing that they did.
The failed parade is just the most relatable fuck up I have ever read about.
Oh yeah, for sure.
You get way too
Because you've
into
thought
it.
of that before.
Yeah, I have
a comedian's parade or something.
Well, it's very parallel to an idea for a show you had that was really high concept.
I'd say
that
most shows I've worked on have
retrospect-
been the Patterson Strike Parade in a way.
I've got 15 hits of acid in my bag. You guys want to make a parade? But no, let's get back to the war. I think that's actually, we kind of back around.
Let's relate this back to Alex's very cogent point about the war and the concept of war economy being, the death knell of a lot of labor movements. One really great example of this is you had this guy, Eugene Debs, who was someone who could run legitimately as a socialist and, make, not a completely tiny speck, not something you would think of today, like a relevant argument for socialism in America.
Around as many people subscribe to socialism as today subscribe to HBO.
Yeah, and someday the damned. Someday we'll get thrown in jail.
Socialism go or socialism now?
Eugene Debs would open his speeches by being like, "Greetings, Debbers." You'd have to redo it 3 times because he wasn't quite in the headspace. So Eugene Debs is someone that spoke out against World War I, and right as he was speaking out against it, there was this thing called the Sedition Act sort of bubbling up in the American government, and it, obviously, the term sedition the point of it was to quiet any dissent, the legal term literally being dissent. I mean, you could be thrown in jail for just speaking out ideologically against the concept that the imperialist government that you lived in was going and joining in World War I in not a completely fucking altruistic fashion. Imagine that, right?
Yeah, and you can't separate Eugene Debs and the American Socialist Party and the socialist movement from the Second International. The Working Men's International, which was basically the successor group to the one founded by Marx and Bakunin before that. Primarily based in Europe, their strongest party was the German Social Democratic Party. And to sign on to this, and again, like the United States, these groups had real power. I mean, the SPD in Germany was a giant mass party. They essentially, went back and forth with the other ruling party for power in Germany at the time. To sign on to the Second International, you had to declare a pledge that you would not vote for war against another country in an imperialist war, because the idea, and it was a very beautiful idea, I wish it had worked out, was that the international solidarity of, say, a French and a German worker, or a, German and Russian worker, is more important than the national chauvinism, of that particular country. So when Deb stands up, and when Emma Goldman stands up, and when many other radicals stand up and they say no to this imperialist war in 1914, 1915, they were only doing what was kind of the traditional stance on war at that point in time, which is, if we don't want any wars, if there's no working class to fight that war, then the capitalists aren't going to get out there with rifles and jump in the fucking trenches. We can stop all wars. And the tragedy of the 20th century, I think maybe many of the tragedies we've seen since, is that Second International failed to live up to their principles, and in a wave of national chauvinism, the German and the French socialist parties voted for war credits. They voted to go to war. The most horrific war up to that point in time, where millions of working class people are killed. And it just really does go to show, too, that it's not just, American leaders getting thrown in jail, but it's millions of working people across Europe and the world really dying because people couldn't get over, like, the language they speak or whatever.
Or whatever.
The language you speak, how you dress, and you show
as long as it's English. Speak American.
Absolutely.
Right. So, the entire IWW and Socialist Party leadership all speaks out against the war, and when the Sedition Act goes into effect, or Espionage Act, sorry, that comes back to bite you. So all those people get thrown in jail. The IWW at this time also comes up with a provision that anybody who's thrown in jail isn't allowed back into the leadership for a certain amount of time, which really cripples the group. First of all, and that
I'm gonna go ahead and say that
years
sucks.
later.
Yeah, it sucks.
Yeah, that fucking sucks.
They also didn't have a very good anti-war platform, because they were all about the class war. So they didn't organize with other pacifist and anti-war groups in the lead up to America going into the First World War to have a united front against that. In fact, they expelled any member who volunteered for the armed forces. So the IWW got a little schizophrenic too when it came to this First World War situation.
And in provisions like you're seeing, like the not being allowed to go back into the group if you've been in jail, are definitely, symptomatic of the power struggles going on inside of this big behemoth of people trying to get their way into the leadership, and schisms and schisms and schisms, and people being cast out left and right. And eventually you get civil unrest in 1918 in Seattle and a general strike.
Fuck yeah.
I believe it's something like starts with longshoremen.
Yeah, it's actually incredible, because the Seattle General Strike of 1918 is often blamed on the IWW, but it was actually, and this goes to show you how kind of like mutable these categories are. There's a lot of AFL, like militant rank and file workers, who also, by the way, you could be in the AFL, this conservative craft union, and still be a socialist, as many people were. And actually, one of the big disagreements between the Socialist Party and the IWW was that socialists and communists should be boring within the AFL. Right, and like working within this conservative group to make it less conservative. In Seattle,
not unlike some bullshit going on today.
Yeah, see, history rhymes. But yeah, no, the Seattle General Strike, longshoremen and also soldiers who had just got done with the war, combining with like Teamsters and all sorts of other groups. It's a very interesting thing if you want to look into it. But the important thing is that it happens right after the Soviet Revolution. So now not only, is there Bolshevism in St. Petersburg and Moscow, but for the ruling class and the politicians in this country, all of a sudden now they see workers in Seattle like downing all their tools and starting to actually run Seattle for themselves and distribute food and like restart production and make goods themselves. And like, holy shit, it's communism, it's here. And that made them even more frightened of the IWW.
They hear the workers saying, I'll have what he's having. And then pointing at Moscow.
And then they're like, check, please.
And then they say, check.
And then everything just devolves into 90s cliches.
Shoot the shit out of everyone.
That's a really interesting point. When we had Matt Chrisman on the show, and I think
that guy?
That guy.
That girl.
The probably still hungover Matt Chrisman. When we had him on the show. I think I was sort of stabbing around trying to isolate, when did the split happen? When ideologically did we sort of gain this amnesia that we have that led to neoliberalism? And he sort of insisted on the, it's the Bolsheviks. That's what scared everyone. But I think, I don't know. I mean, honestly, I don't fucking know. I don't know anything. I'm just the host of the show. I'm a comedian. I'm learning shit. But to me, in reading about like the Red Scare stuff and the Palmer raids and stuff like that, it seemed like maybe, a combination of, this whole thing with Bolsheviks, and then also, like you're saying, like the scare of like it's happening in our state right now. This thing in Seattle, like, I don't know where I'm going with this. I don't know.
No, I think I pick up your point. Go ahead, Alex.
Well, the reason I brought up the general strike is because that, in addition to the fear of Bolshevism abroad, leads just enough public support for the government to kind of just crack down.
Plus
the hammer
like
comes.
Legitimately anarchists bombing Wall Street. That also didn't help either.
Yeah.
Those are the less like shop floor type anarchists and more propaganda of the deed. Like, let's blow up the bankers.
I heard that happened after the Palmer raids, though.
Did it?
Yeah, it was like at the end.
It was the denouement.
It was the denouement. Because what happens, okay, so you get U.S. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, supported by a young and handsome J. Edgar Hoover, a young debutante.
That's why this is, okay, that's kind of where I was trying to get at with this. With history, I think it's more important to understand the large ideological, like, broad concepts that are making these things happen. And it's tempting for a lot of people to go, wow, maybe this one person changed everything. Maybe this one guy that fucking shot Archduke Ferdinand, if that hadn't happened, then this whole thing would have changed or whatever. And I got kind of down one of those wormholes when I was reading about the FBI, where this guy that's fucking that made the Red Raids happen, and then J. Edgar Hoover being an underling of his, and then a person who then went on to fucking head the FBI forever. These are like two specific individuals that, beyond the government being really fucking anti, left and anti-socialist or whatever, they specifically as individuals, if you read about them, they're like demented, like specific people. They have like these weird. J. Edgar Hoover's a fucking insane person. And
listen, not all men who wear dresses are insane. And I'm actually quite offended. I guess our podcast is much more woke than yours. But point taken.
That's the most sane thing about him, I'll say.
That he wears dresses.
He had a job that he held longer than, really should be held, or just because it was, kind of a made-up office or whatever.
Do you watch Men in the High Castle?
I haven't. I heard it's really good.
J. Edgar Hoover's in it. And he's a collaborator with the
Yeah.
Nazis, which is actually a
get
really
him?
fun little historical thing to throw in there. But I'll make a short point about that, but I think it's an important one, is that there's always structure and then there's always contingency in history, right? Mm-hmm. So J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI arises out of these Palmer raids, right, which are a real reaction to international and also national issues that are happening at the time. A lot of the reason why labor history is so violent in the United States is because, especially out west where the IWW really gets its base from, there isn't a very strong, state capacity to do stuff. There is not a federal Bureau of Investigation to go from state to state and be able to prosecute people for particular things. There aren't particularly strong, sheriffs or police in any small town like Goldfield, Nevada, right? So the situation that ends up happening is that these capitalist thugs are hiring these Pinkerton thugs in order to spy on, kill, beat up, and strike break against these workers, because the state, as we understand it, with all this surveillance and with its ability to be everywhere at once, and there's this codified law about labor relations and what you can do in a strike and what you can't do, did not exist. So even J. Edgar Hoover is this funny example because even if J. Edgar Hoover had not existed and worn those dresses and done the things that he did, you still needed something like a J. Edgar Hoover type paranoid kind of agent in history in order to come in and root out this real threat to like what they considered Americanism, right? You know, this idea that America is a classless society going back to the Constitution. Like, we don't have classes here. That's a European thing. If you're, trying to, fight the class war and you're trying to get better wages, you must be a foreign agent or you must be a provocateur. In World War I, they were running around the country trying to figure out where all the gold was that the Huns, the Germans, gave to the Wobblies, to start strikes during the fucking war because they were convinced in their heads that there had to be some sort of conspiracy between the Kaisers and Big Bill Haywood, in order to take down America. But like that paranoid thinking.
Where's the gold, Big Bill?
I want to know where the gold's at. Everybody see the gold in the just remember that one. Everyone see the leprechaun say hey.
Oh yeah, the leprechaun in the tree.
This is my grandfather's old hobo whittling flute. Where's the Wobblies at?
Okay, yeah, fair enough.
No, so I think it's a good point, actually. Like, if J. Edgar Hoover didn't exist, then historical materialist dialectics would have to create him.
That's true. He would be formed from the aethosphere.
That makes sense. I guess I was just trying to wrap my head around that because I read one of Tim Weiner's books, this guy that wrote about a book called Legacy of Ashes about the CIA and another one about the FBI.
I read that one.
There was something that I couldn't really quite place about it, and I think it was just because he had such a narrative explanation of all this stuff and not like a historical fucking I'm drunk, I forgot the second part. Materials.
We're gonna drink more, don't worry.
Historical materials, like a conceptual part of it. So I've been kind of struggling to get all this through my head. Thank you for explaining.
I think that you're talking about structures, right?
Yeah.
So like, this is something, and we're going to get out of the Pomeroys in the fall of the IWW, and we're going to get into what we can take from this history today, because that's always, of course, very important for our propaganda. But ultimately, the class struggle, which I think back then was real, and I still believe that there is a class struggle today, even if it is merely that you want to work less hours for more money and your boss wants you to work more hours for less money. That is a structural reality that exists. There has to be some sort of mechanism that mediates those things, whether it is a union or whether it is the state, right? We're getting into a point in time, we saw the chaos of, what the Wobbly time looked like. It was beautiful chaos, but we're getting to the point now where it's almost chaotic again, right? Like, the
suspenders are coming back.
Suspenders are back. Handlebar mustaches. God damn it! If I didn't see a guy on top of a fucking Amtrak train the other day, just riding the rails, trying to find work at a podcast factory somewhere, like everything that's old is new again, And
got a soapbox outside of here.
Let's start soapboxing. Is Bedford Avenue still cool to hang out at? Should we?
Absolutely not.
No, of course. There is a Salvation Army. Oh wait, no, they knocked that down and put up a luxury high-rise. Sorry.
Thing that I've been kind of thinking about as we describe, like, what's going on in this period in history being a sort of it seems like the other end of a certain time period. Like, we went into a sort of way of thinking about things and then came out of it. Like, we're now sort of at the it's something people would describe as late capitalism or whatever, or something where we're starting to see the things we once thought to be completely unquestionable parts of our society come apart. It keeps reminding me of something that a friend of the show and previous guest, Luisa Diaz, my friend, comedy booker, and anthropologist, once said to me, which is that when you look at Trump and his whole like concept of nostalgia and like make America great again and all that stuff, there's something really interesting that happens when you talk to not your parents' generation, but like your grandparents' generation. For a lot of us, especially those of us that are like from families of immigrants, that if you go back far enough and you talk to people that were involved in this part of American history, you realize you have more in common with them than you do with the people that lived in the middle part, the part in between here and there, where there was this semblance of like normalcy, where there was this constructed society that was supposed to exist forever, and then suddenly we're living in this strange thing where it's coming apart. And
neoliberal hell world, I think is what we call it.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
It was a short forever.
Dead ass, as you would say on the
thank you.
Antifada.
Yeah. That's a Jamie call right there. Bousquet.
Yeah, so that's a bousquet right there, and a bousquet to you.
I listened to my pod, damn, goddammit. I'm damn too.
Hell yeah.
So essentially, the state decides they've had enough of these uppity labor folks, and they start raiding union halls. They jail the leadership. They send away activists like Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman, who's an anarchist guy. They just like put them on a boat to the Soviet Union. They just start putting people on boats.
Nothing is more insulting than being sent away on a boat.
I know it wasn't like this, but I always imagine it like when they put I think, is it Rudolph gets put on the boat on the, like the just like piece of wood just out to sea,
Like a floe, like
an ice floe,
a wood floe.
Yeah.
Back to Russia with ye.
Yeah, they just send them out. And
That's
like,
why his red nose. It all makes sense.
Comrade. He was
drink on
comrade.
a boat.
And his friend, the dentist, was like a unionist of some kind.
Trying to organize the teeth.
Unionized dentists.
Okay, yeah, so the state really strikes out and crushes all these people, and public opinion actually turns against the Pomerades pretty quickly because it's so obvious how heavy-handed and authoritarian they are. But the thing is, and this is an important lesson for now, is it doesn't really matter what public opinion is if you have no power. Like, a lot of people are against ICE, but ICE still does whatever the fuck they want because there's no reason not to. And that's essentially what happens here. And then you get the Wall Street bombing you were talking about earlier. And that was something pointed out in the book I was reading by Philip Dre, There's Power in the Union. The Wall Street bombing happens after the Palmer raids, and the public opinion is still so stacked against the government that by this point, because they look so bad, that they're kind of like, you win some, you lose some. Even though it's a major terrorist attack in a major metropolitan area.
Not too many people felt that way on September 11th.
Yeah.
Got a couple towers. Yeah, we got more.
Yeah. We have so many. It's a town full of towers. So the damage is done. Labor is very seriously crippled at this point. The war ends, and everybody tries to go back to work. There was a no-strike clause during the war, as was mentioned earlier, so the war's over. We can go back to striking again. JK. Everyone kind of hates us now because they're still in war mode. And we won the war, so we look like double assholes because we were against the war. And so you have this kind of like swelling and contracting population in the Union going up. 1923 was actually like their biggest year for membership in the IWW, and then there's a big schism in 1924. And you were saying off mic that there was a culture against unions and for the open shops, and it's essentially like right-to-work legislation before right-to-work legislation in the 1920s. There's pushback towards unions, and so there's all these schisms happening inside the IWW. The leadership tears itself apart, and essentially everybody by 1924 either flees to the Communist Party, which is actually cool at the time, or just splits off into 9 different other labor groups.
Yeah, I mean, my take on this, and to remind folks, there is still an IWW around. You can go find them.
I know people that are like Wobblies right now.
Yeah, Noam Chomsky is one.
Heather Heyer,
there you go.
died at Charlottesville, was a
martyr.
Yeah,
Joe Hill of our era, and I'm not saying that ironically. Yeah, I mean, the IWW is still around. Shout out to D. Shout out to Skip. What's up, fam? But really with this, as you said, the heyday, right, and the decline afterwards, it becomes a bit of a shell of itself in some senses. I'm going to try to recuperate that towards the end. But, yeah, the 1920s, it's fascinating because industrial unionism is clearly so threatening, to not just capital and the state, but just, law and order in general. This idea that black workers and white workers in the South, working in forestry, or that Hungarians and, God forbid, Armenians and whoever could come together with Italians, and strike a company, regardless of their skill level. That was always very frightening. And with the Palmer raids and then later the open shop movement, capital was back on the offensive at this point in time, with what seemed to be a very booming economy.
Everyone was doing the Charleston.
Yes, there was those 20s were rolling, I tell you. So really, if you were to imagine in let's say 1928, right before the stock market crashed, the IWW is on their ass. There's really only pockets of industrial unionism across the country. The AFL, right, and the Gompers organization, these skilled craftsmen are on their ass too. They're almost gone. Actually, the union density rate in the 1920s in this period was about as low as it is right now. And if you were a reasonable observer back then, you'd say, oh, well, I guess this whole idea of unions and the class struggle is just a dead letter. It's the roaring 20s. Capitalism fixed all its problems. We're going to go on forever and be great. Of course, that's not what happens. The leaders that you talked about who went into the CP, obviously they were instrumental in forming the next great industrial union, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, right? But also those 800,000 to 1 million people that passed through the IWW, that learned those songs, that heard that shit on the soapboxes, that actually went out and struck, they were still around and they were older. There was some memory, right, of what these people had created with the Wobblies. When the 1930s come, you see mass industrial organizing with the Congress of Industrial Organizers, which breaks out, similar to the IWW, from the AFL and says we are going to industrially organize. And with the help of communist organizers, socialist organizers, some anarchists, and ultimately 8 to 10 million American people, mass unionism through the CIO comes back into the picture in a big way. So it's very easy for us to say to sit here right now at this moment in time and be like, well, we've lost this mentality. People don't understand things in these terms any longer. I am just a person that goes on Twitter and, shit posts an email that I got from a PR person because they wanted to come on the Antifada to talk about the midterm elections, and I told them that we are literally communists, you idiot. That's the sort of praxis we have nowadays. But in the 1920s, you would have thought the same thing, that there was no future. And instead, as Jake mentioned, you had such a strong labor movement that arises in the Great Depression, a radical and militant one that's not afraid to go on sit-down strike, that's not afraid to have sympathy strikes, boycotts, right, general strikes. Such a powerful working class movement that it creates what we call the middle class of this golden era of capitalism. So in a sense, the IWW dies in the 1920s, but long live the IWW, because they seed this conception of industrial unionism, and that goes on with the CIO and creates this 40-year stretch where all that stability, all that boomer happiness, all that abundance, that we always talk shit on, is actually possible because millions of people put their asses on the line to directly confront the bosses, legally or illegally, with the same sort of fervor, maybe a little different ideology, but same fervor as the Wobblies had before them.
Fucking A.
Right. And then the CIO merges with the AFL, and they work with the CIA to ruin left-wing organizations around the world.
Yeah, they done fucked up on that part. Well, by the time
It's a long time ago, folks. A lot of shit happened.
By the time the AFL and the CIO combine, all the Reds have been kicked out under the Taft-Hartley Act. You literally had to say you weren't a communist to be to be a union official.
Everyone knows if you're a communist, you have to tell us. It's one of the rules.
Folks, I am a communist. All right? Jake and Alex won't arrest me now. Wouldn't that be crazy if you guys were just cops? That'd be such a good idea for a show.
That would be crazy.
Yes, would be indeed.
Something we've never talked about on air is how strong we are.
Can you imagine if we were cops?
So did you guys use a 22-ounce hammer or a 28? I prefer an S-wing framing hammer myself.
Where do you like to go to do crimes after this?
Yeah.
Wait, union crimes or normal crimes?
We're trying to be cops. Alex is just talking like a radio cartoon character. I'm talking about World of Warcraft. And they're like, this sting operation isn't going to work. There's no way these guys can integrate into any society.
The more we talk about the just level of dysfunction, sounds like it could be true.
It's like the parade,
Yeah. That's true. Cops have equally dumb ideas.
The best laid plans of mice and men. So yeah, I would say in conclusion on the Wobbly stuff, because we passed through a lot of history, right? But if you look at what the IWW, the leadership and the rank and file were confronting, was a period where industry was changing, automation was coming in, people were being de-skilled, which means they were replaceable. You had a migratory, precarious workforce. If you look back at that moment, similar to what Jake said, kind of feels like we're back in that era. It kind of feels like, I don't know, my thesis is that boomer generation that lived through these great golden years of capitalism, that was the aberration.
That's
was
exactly
right.
what I think Louisa was getting at, and something that I think is like, it's so weird because we're experiencing, a parallax distortion about it, where it seems your intuition would tell you this is the aberration and that was normal, but then if you look at things in a historical context, it very much seems that that's not the case at all.
My grandfather used to go down, and he's before the boomers. In Queens, he used to go down to the railroad yard, and he would go and get the coal that fell off of the cars, and he'd bring them home to their little Archie Bunker house in Queens because that's how they could heat their house. We're not that far away from that history. And one of the great things I'll say about the IWW that exists today is that it has what, in a sense, the DSA also has to an extent, which is there's a historical memory there. And there's also an institutional memory of struggles past that we can tap into, right? That we can potentially use, to inspire ourselves and those around us in order to, not be the IWW, although that's fine, but, bring that fucking class struggle back home, baby.
Goddamn right. That's, I would say, the Antifada mindset.
Yeah, I'd say it's damned as fuck.
Goddamn fucking right. This has been,
Was that your impression of me? Fuck you. Dead ass. I'm Sean KB from the Antifada. We are totally not cops. Yeah. Don't steal my pie.
Stop resisting.
I don't know what that was.
Hobo core forever.
That was just Vincent Price chiming back in. Dead ass.
Dead ass.
Yeah, I mean, unless anyone else has a really solid, point to put on the end of this, I think maybe that was 2 hours of cross podcast about the IWW. Did we do it?
It's a beautiful synthesis.
It is indeed. Hasta la Victoria siempre.
Yeah, well, fucking A, Sean, KB, thank you for joining us, and thank you, everyone, for listening as we went through a little bit of history of labor there.
Jake Flores, thank you for appearing again on the Antifada. First time on History as a Weapon. And Alex Ptak, as a first-time guest, you get an IWW red card.
All right. Thanks for having me, Sean.
You're our first cop.
You get a compilation CD from fucking Joe Hill with a bunch of shitty Fat Records bands on it instead of payment.
I was gonna say Hellcat. You made it even worse.
Yeah. I was just drawing from experience there. Anyways, right. Thank you for listening. Thank you, the Damned. Thank you, the Antifada's listeners. Before I get out of here, I guess I should plug all our normal stuff. Obviously, rate, review, subscribe, listen to the Antifada, listen to Pod Damn America. If you guys came out to Yoko, my live stand-up show the other night, thank you for coming. Sorry there were no seats. That was a little weird. We're going to fix it next time around. A little bit of a snafu, but show's going strong. Yeah, and, as always, patreon.com/PodDamnAmerica for bonus episodes and everything. And I'm going on tour again. So if you're a fan and you listen from any part of the country ranging from Texas to, I'd say, the Southwest, that sounds like that's where I'm sort of headed next. Keep track. Look at my my website and my pinned tweets. I think I'm going back on the road with my pal Mishka Shubali, the guy I worked with last time around, and I think we're going to head from about Texas up maybe to California. So, keep just track of that. Anything, Alex?
Yes. Come to Paid Protests, November 24th. We're working with Electoral in the delicious sin of electoralism at Mayday Space at 7 p.m.
Debs would be proud.
We got a hot lineup. You want to be there. It's going to be fun. Come get drunk with us.
Anything for you?
Yes. So these guys are talking about tours. We are taking our own personal tour to Mexico because we need a vacation from podcasting. It's brutal work. So while you sign up for Pod Damn America, which you damn should, and while you're on your way to going to see live shows with these two wonderful gentlemen, you can also sign up to be a patron of the Antifada at patreon.com/the The Antifada, where you get ridiculous, stupid bonus material that's mostly just us talking shit and audio riot porn. And you can also be part of our Discord community and hang out with us online, like real fucking late capitalist subjects.
Folks, don't you want to be part of a community?
Dead ass.
Hell yeah.
Dead ass everyone. All right.